It's the first day of spring, and since the weather is perfect, it's warm and dry, I will attempt to paint strip the Orion's case. Now, as you can see for yourselves, the lacquer and the paint on the case, on the cabinet, if you wish, is really bad. It's crackled, it's flaking off, it's dry, it's really not good at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a quick dust off with some compressed air, and I'm going to remove the feet from the bottom of the cabinet, you know, these little strips here, these feet, and then I'm going to give the whole cabinet a stripping with paint stripper, something like this. I'm not familiar with the brand. It's called Wood Lover, and it's supposed to be easily, or rather to easily remove paint without too much effort. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but and they all also say it's water based, so I suppose it's more or less environmentally friendly. But well, no matter what they pretend, it's still a chemical product. So I'd advise you to use stuff like that outside, outdoors, I mean. I laid down quite a heavy coating of the paint remover on the cabinet of the Orion, and according to the instructions I read on the paint remover can, I had to apply a thick coating of the stuff, which is more like a gel than a liquid, and then they say I have to let it dry, and once it's dry I have to reactivate it with a fine mist of water, and then remove it, I suppose with a sponge, a wet sponge or something like that. They say use a high pressure hose, but I'm not going to do that, of course. I'm not going to use a high pressure water on this. So I'm just going to follow their instructions up to the point where I need to remove it. So then I'll use a spray can to spray a fine mist of water over it to reactivate it, as they say. And then I'll probably have to use well, a spatula or something like that to remove the lacquer and the paint from the cabinet. I just finished rinsing the cabinet after giving it a solid layer of decapping product, and well, you know, the product is based on sodium hydroxide, but in my opinion it doesn't do a lot. After applying 2 layers of sodium hydroxide and letting it work for half an hour or so, well, I'm a little bit disappointed with the result. So what I'll do next, instead of continuing with the decapping product, is to let the wood dry and then give it a sanding. Not aggressively, but still, I think I'll switch over to sanding the cabinet to get a smooth, well, a smooth surface on which we will ultimately be able to apply stain and well, lacquer. Now, I don't want to remove some of the obvious dings and scratch marks and all that, because you know the cabinet had a life, and the radio was used over 60 years ago and went through a lot, and you know, it went through a revolution and through all sorts of use and misuse. So I don't want to take away its history, you know, but I still want to give it a finish which at least evokes the way it must have looked so many years ago. And just to give it perhaps a little bit cleaner appearance. But that's about it. I really don't want to go overboard and making it look like it's brand new, because it isn't. It's the Orion's cabinet, a treatment with sodium hydroxide, and as you can see, although the sodium hydroxide did remove some of the lacquer, it did not remove all of it, not even close. So I switched over to sanding it with sanding paper, 240 grit. So I think with a lot of patience I could sand off the remaining lacquer. As you can see, there's still quite a bit left. Also, sanding off the lacquer did reveal a few, well, minor problems with the wood. As you can see here, the wood is splitting. Now, in itself, the split is not too bad. I can fill it up with wood filler or something like that, and once it's filled with wood filler, well, you won't even notice that the wood was split here. Anyway, yeah, and it's also lifting a little bit, so I might have to, well, maybe glue it down with some wood glue. I don't know yet. Anyway, the job right now is coming down to sanding it all off, and once it's sanded, then we can start the serious work of staining and re-lacquering it. Well, after a couple of hours of sanding with some coarser sandpaper, I switched from 240 to 100 grit. I finally managed to strip off the lacquer layer from the top part of the Orion's cabinet. Now, as you can see, the wood is actually not bad. It's marbled slightly. Let me wipe it off so you can see it better. So I'm using a damp rag to wipe it off a bit. So there you go. This is actually the grain of the wood. Now it's really nice kind of grain. Although I'll be damned if I know which kind of wood this is, but the grain is really nice. So if anybody of you knows what type of wood this might be, well, let me know. I'm curious. Now anyway, you can see the wood was a little bit damaged on top. You see a scratch here, one there, and then a few here, maybe one here. But you know, that's just part of the life of this radio. So I don't think I will do anything to correct this. It's just part of its history. So yeah, that's what it looks like after a couple of hours of sanding. And as you can see, the edges are a slightly tighter type of grain than the body of the cabinet. So I don't know. I think the sides are made out of softer wood than the middle, because this sands a lot easier, and if I'm not careful I would sand off the wood completely if I didn't do it gently. So I think the edges are actually tighter grained but softer, whereas the center part of the cabinet is harder wood and a little bit coarser grain. But like I said, I have no clue what type of wood it would be. Now the funny thing is, there is a darker band of wood down the center of the cabinet. Now whether that was intentional or the wood just aged that way, well, I guess we'll never know. Now my guess is maybe the discoloring could also be attributed to the heat coming off the vacuum tubes of the chassis. That's possible too, that the wood simply discolored of the heat. But why it would be so nicely down the middle, well, that's a little bit of a mystery to me. Anyway, that's it for the top. Now I still have 3 other sides to do. I'm still at it. As you can see, I'm still sanding, but just one tip for you if you want to restore a radio yourselves. In case you're wondering how much and where to sand, well, if you have to sand off lacquer, as you can see, the lacquer has a peculiar kind of glint when it's sanded, which the wood doesn't have. So if you're looking for the spots to sand, then hold the piece into the sunlight and look for places or spots where the lacquer or paint glints. And when you see those, then you have identified the spots that need a little bit more sanding. When you have to sand off lacquer or paint from a surface, doesn't really matter whether it's wood, plastic or metal, then you should always rub, if possible, with the grain and or otherwise in small circles, by which I mean not tiny circles, but small circular movements. Also keep in mind that when you sand paint or lacquer, the paint or lacquer will heat up and will quickly become more rubbery in texture, and the result is this. As you can see, the heated up lacquer stuck to the sanding paper, which of course greatly diminishes the effectiveness of the sanding paper. So it's not a bad thing to stop once in a while to let the surface you're sanding cool off, and with it of course the paint or the lacquer. So that's my tip for now. I'm going to fill the little opening you see here, this, well, crack in the wood, and this one, with something which is called wood filler, which apparently can be painted over. Now the thing is, I'm going to use this because it remains a little bit elastic even after it dries, which is perfect, of course, for my purposes. Now this stuff is white, and obviously I need a little bit darker color, so I'm going to use tiny little wood shavings, which you see here, to color the wood filler in the tube. I'm going to use tiny quantity, and I'm going to color the wood filler with a little bit of these wood shavings, just so that it isn't white but more wood color like, obviously. So I'm going to cut a little spatula, a tiny spatula at the end of this little stick of wood, and I'm going to use that spatula to mix the wood shavings with the paste and then apply it into the crack you see here and there. So that's what I'm going to do. And there you go. I mixed a little bit of the paste, as you can see, and I applied it onto the crack. I filled the crack with the paste, and the paste dries really quickly, so you have to be really quick to fill it up, because otherwise it becomes completely dry and you can't do a thing with it any longer. Now don't worry, I'm still going to sand with very fine grit the cabinet, so the excess filler, which you see over there, I'm going to sand off or sand away, so no worries there. So I'll leave the paste to dry completely, then I'll check it once more, and if it's still not good enough, I mean the crack which needs to be filled, then I'll apply a second layer. Well, this is the end result of about 6 hours of sanding. Now, as you can tell for yourselves, the wood looks a lot lighter than how it was originally. I mean painted or lacquered. And well, I suppose well, the edges were dark, that's for sure. Well, I wouldn't say they were black, but they were certainly very, very dark. Now, I'm not going to make them as dark as they were, because I want to be able to still see these little dovetail assemblies, which you see here and here. You know, those details are worth showing, I believe, and therefore I think I will use a dark lacquer but still transparent. So I want to be able to show off these little details. Now, as for the body itself, the cabinet body itself, I will use a lighter lacquer because the wood is nice. Okay, it's not probably, by some people's standards, it's probably not extremely beautiful, but it's natural, and I like the natural style. Although I want to use a slightly darker lacquer so that it reminds somewhat of what it used to be, so its original lacquered color. Now, you can see the cabinet itself is not perfect. There are some scratches and little indents here and there. There was also a break in the wood, so I had to repair that, and it looks lighter than the surrounding wood, but that's no problem at all. I can correct that with a little bit of wood paint so that it becomes slightly darker and blends in with the wood. So that's okay. So yeah, plenty of cracks and scratches and little indents. But hey, you know, this object was used for over 60 years, so it's normal it shows its age. So I think once it's lacquered and reassembled, the cabinet will look great. Also, hang on. The feet of which were mounted on the radio were also lacquered in the same kind of dark lacquer they used on the cabinet. Now, I have to admit, those feet are not what you would call exceptionally beautiful or anything. The nice detail about them, though, is that they have one flat side and one slightly curved side. Now, the feet were meant to be put underneath the cabinet like this, yeah. And since the cabinet is slightly rounded, as you can see for yourselves, when you put the feet on the cabinet like this, the rounded edge of the feet will make them fit perfectly with the cabinet itself. Underneath, of course, not on top. Now, what I did notice was that they probably mounted the feet first to the cabinet and then they paint the whole thing. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to paint the cabinet first and the feet separately, and then when both are dry and polished, then I will remount the feet. So yeah, and also I will tack some little rubber feet inside these things. So there was a kind of a rubber or a sort of a dirty foamy material inside these feet, and I'm going to replace them by modern translucent feet, rubber feet, which are also anti-slip. So yeah, once the whole thing is lacquered and finished, you know, polished and everything, I think the result will be magnificent. And then, of course, once I mount the front bezel and the glass tuning panel here, it will look doubly nice. I am convinced of it. So that's it for now. I forgot to mention one more detail. Okay, so I'm showing you how the feet would normally sit on the cabinet. So you can see the rounding they gave to the feet sort of matches exactly, or nearly so, the rounding of the cabinet. Now, the wood from which the body of the cabinet is built looks like one piece, but actually it's a very primitive kind of plywood consisting of two layers, and I'm looking for a spot where you could possibly see it, but it's very hard to see. But the wood is actually a double layer. So you could say it's a primitive kind of plywood, where they used probably some cheap kind of wood for the inside of the cabinet, and some more expensive kind of veneer for the outside. So yeah, back then they already used plywood, so plywood is certainly not a new kind of material. So that's it. I finished I finished putting a second layer of lacquer wood toner on top of my Orion's cabinet, and the result is looking pretty nice. I also had to switch from camera. My other camera has broken down. I don't know why, but well, it means that for the moment I'll have to make little films with this camera, which is a normal handheld camera. Anyway, I'm waiting for the second layer to dry, and I think I'm going to apply a third layer. And when the third layer is dry, then I will start painting the edges with the darker lacquer I bought, which is this one. Yeah. And when that is done, I'll coat the whole thing with some satin glossy transparent lacquer, which is this. Okay. Now it happens to be water resistant, but that's totally irrelevant actually. So okay, that is what I'm going to do. Now a small remark about painting with a roller. One of the reasons why I'm using a roller is because spray cans are also bad for the environment. And since I'm trying to be a little bit environment conscious, I thought it would be nicer to use a roller. Okay? And anyway, you lose less lacquer using a roller, and you can spread it just as well as with spray cans, although it just asks a little bit more work. But that's about it. Okay, for some inexplicable reason, my camera started working again. I don't know, maybe it was just a glitch of some kind. Anyway, as you can see, I painted the whole cabinet with the toner lacquer. And don't worry if it looks a little bit dark, but I still need to sand it once I'm done with painting the edges. Now I'm taking off the tape from the edge, as you can see, and but I have to be a little bit careful doing it, because, well, obviously we don't want to tear off the freshly painted lacquer. So here we go. So, well, that looks okay. So here we go. As you can see, I'm doing it bit by bit. Okay, I'm not forcing the issue and trying to tear off the tape completely in one go, but I'm doing it slowly, and I'm pulling straight on the tape. Okay, so it's not like pulling it up in an oblique way, but I'm pulling it straight. Okay, hang on, I need to lie it down like this. Okay, here we go. Doing this with one hand isn't too easy, but we'll manage, I suppose. There you go. Okay. Yes. Well, I'm going to paint the outer edge, which I'm uncovering now, with a slightly darker toner lacquer, and I think I'll need less layers than the few layers I had to put onto the body of the cabinet, because it is darker toner lacquer and not a lighter one which I used on the body, obviously. So yeah, well, hang on. Okay, so you saw me uncover the front edge of the radio. So now I'm going to uncover the back edge of the radio, and then I'm going to start covering the body with paper and tape, so that we can roll darker lacquer over the edges of the cabinet. So that's the next step. I taped off the whole body of the Orion's chassis, as you can tell for yourselves, and I took care, of course, to clear the edges, which of course I'm going to lacquer. I'm still a bit undecided whether I should paint the edges as they were originally painted in much darker lacquer, or if I would reverse, as it were, what it was and paint it in a lighter lacquer, since the bezel is ivory colored. And I think if I painted the edge almost, well, black-like, or at least very dark brown, then, you know, it would sort of, well, clash with the bezel. So I'm seriously considering painting the edges in a lighter color and not in a darker one as it used to be. Well, I'm still considering it. Anyway, as you can tell for yourselves, it's now completely covered top to bottom with a special kind of tape. You know, I showed to you before. This yellow kind of tape is supposed to be used on painted surfaces in order not to pull off the paint when you're done, which is not a bad idea, actually. So well, that's it. I'm just going to consider a few more minutes whether I'm going to do the edges in clear toner lacquer or in dark one. Oh, and as a small detail, if you're wondering what the symbol for my country is, Belgium, well, this is the official flag and logo of Belgium. Okay? Well, that's it. So now on with painting the rest of the cabinet. If you want to have a good idea how the radio will look once it is lacquered, you could take a damp sponge like this and then wipe the wood off like this, the lacquered wood, and that way you get a pretty good idea how it will look like once you lacquered it with transparent lacquer. And as you can see for yourselves, it will look quite nice. Yeah, a marbled wooden surface where you still see some of the wood grain, and you see that nice marble pattern which makes a wooden cabinets so nice to look at? Well, also now you're seeing the color pattern that I will use to paint the cabinet, or well, to lacquer the cabinet. I decided in the end that I would not finish the edges off in almost black lacquer, but rather in a more, well, it's not exactly clear coat or transparent lacquer. It's very lightly colored. Yeah, you could almost say natural wood color, like the wood you see right now, only perhaps a little bit darker. And the reason why is because I found the details of the cabinet, you know, how it was assembled, and the precision with which it was done so many years ago, just too nice to hide behind black lacquer. So no, I'm not going to lacquer the edges dark. Rather, I will keep them the way they are. The only thing that needs a coating of stain, of light stain and lacquer are, well, aside for the cabinet of course, are the feet. So that's about the only thing I need to do. Well, remember when I wetted the wood with the sponge, how it looked like? Well, this is how it looks like with a fresh coating of clear lacquer. And as you can tell for yourselves, it really looks quite similar to being wet. Obviously, it will need more than one coating. However, what I hadn't counted on was that the lacquer needs about 5 hours to dry. 5 hours. So I'm afraid I'll only be able to put a second layer tomorrow. Well, let's just hope for the best. I just finished giving the Orion's cabinet a second transparent coating or lacquer layer, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to wait 24 hours for the lacquer to completely cure. Once the lacquer is cured, I will give it a very light sanding. I mean, I'm not going to go overboard. I'm just going to give it a nice soft sanding to take out any crazing in the lacquer or any irregularities. And then I will give the lacquer a final and third coating. Now, there is one little detail I want to show you, and that is that. I don't know if you can see it, but if I make a close-up, you see the dent in the wood over there. Now, as you could tell for yourselves, I made a sort of a strange kind of contraption to hang up the cabinet in the air so that it's not resting on anything, and as you can see inside it is resting on a pot of lacquer, which itself is balancing on a kind of a lever which I'm holding up with a heavy concrete block you see here. So the reason for that is quite simple. That dent in the wood, which I'm showing you here, is rather deep, and what I did was I put a drop of clear lacquer into the dent. So you could say I filled up the dent with clear lacquer. And I tried to put just enough lacquer to fill up the dent. And I think I more or less succeeded. Okay, there's a little bit of overspill, as you can tell, but it's really minimal. And anyway, since I'm going to give the lacquer a sanding, the overspill will be sanded away. Now, the real trick that I wanted to tell you is that I didn't use any kind of implement to sort of rub out the lacquer you see there into the crack, but I simply and quite softly blew in the direction I wanted the lacquer to flow. So I in fact used my breath as a kind of an air pencil. And I must say it's a trick that works rather well. And the viscosity of the lacquer will do the rest of the work. So the lacquer will slowly settle into a, I hope, mirror smooth surface and fill up the crack completely, smoothly and flatly. So that's it for now. Okay, here's a good tip. If you need to give a surface a fine grit sanding, okay, like I'm going to do now with 1000 grit sanding paper, okay, then there are a few things you need to know, or at least to remember. First of all, you're going to give something a very fine sandpaper sanding, yeah, or fine grit sanding, because you need to finish a surface which is already quite smooth but needs to be smoothened even more. And as you can see, putting a second layer of transparent lacquer marbled the lacquer surface. And of course we don't want that marbling. We would prefer to have a surface that is really smooth and flat. So I'm going to give it a very light sanding with 1000 grade sanding paper, so very fine sanding paper. Second, this is water sanding paper, okay, so we're going to give it a wet sanding. Now the reason why you would use wet sanding as opposed to dry sanding is that when you have a surface which is soft, yes, and very sensitive to temperature, like plastic or maybe even bakelite, or in this case lacquer or paint, so any surface which really becomes soft when exposed to heat, then you should switch to water sanding, to wet sanding. And the reason for that is very simple. If you start to sand a surface which is susceptible to heat deformation, then you need to keep that surface as cool as possible while sanding it, because obviously when you're sanding a surface you're also heating it up. Now you obviously don't want any sanding particles to go into the surface you're sanding. So the only way to keep it cool and yet to be able to sand it is by using, of course, wet sanding. Think of it a little bit like people working on a metal lathe where they cut and grind metal pieces. You'll often see them pour a liquid onto the grinding head, and that's often oil or sometimes water. And the only reason for it is not so much to make it greasy and slippery, but to cool it down. So that is what I'm going to do. I already prepared the water, and I cut a piece onto which I'm going to put a sanding block. Yeah. Now, a second tip I'm going to give you is that if you're going to use water like I am to give a wet sanding, just put 1 or 2 drops of detergent into the water. And mind you, don't overdo it. 1 or 2 drops will do. The only reason is that detergent is a surfactant, and it lowers the surface tension of water, which means that the water will spread more evenly over a surface and not tend to pool in droplets. Because, of course, you want the water to cover the surface you're going to grind as evenly as possible. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to give the Orion's lacquered cabinet a wet sanding to make it as smooth as possible before I put the last layer of lacquer on top of it. I gave it a very light sanding everywhere. The whole surface was sanded down with wet sanding paper, and of course you can't see it, and obviously you can't feel it, but now it really feels smooth like glass. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the surface a final rub down with a clean cloth, and when that is done, I'll give the wood its final layer of lacquer. Well, if you thought that sanding the previous layer of lacquer would alter in any sort of way the luster of the new layer of lacquer, well, then obviously you were wrong. As you can tell for yourselves, it is really shiny and extremely nice. The texture is very, very nice, and well, I'm in the process of letting the lacquer dry, and once the lacquer is dried, I will mount back the bezel, the front in other words, of the radio. Well, as you can tell, it was a rather involved process. So you really need to put quite a few layers of lacquer, and you need to have the patience to wait for the lacquer to dry, and the toner, and then sand it, and then clean it off, and then lacquer again. So this is obviously not something you can do in a day or two. You really need to have patience and perseverance. Anyway, this concludes this video for now, and I'll be back with more updates on the Orion soon.